Mornings in suburban America always begin so gently. The sun doesn't rush to rise, but leisurely drops pale golden rays through the bare branches of late-season maple trees. The air is still touched with mist, the breath of the night lingering on the wooden porch steps and the quiet stone bench in the backyard. The small town feels like it's caught in a dream, where time slows down, as tender as the breath of an elderly person dozing off after a warm cup of tea. At the end of that quiet street sits an old cream-colored house where Mrs. Grace lives with her daughter Sarah. The house isn't large, but it's warm. Every morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, Grace carefully puts on her dark wool coat, dons the worn beret her husband gifted her years ago, and leaves the house with a small basket in hand. The neighbors are used to the sight of the silver-haired lady walking alone to the supermarket. Her steps are slow but steady. She walks under tree-lined streets, gently greeting the mailman, smiling at the neighbor watering his plants. Despite her age, Grace carries a sense of serenity, her life unfolding in a quiet rhythm as if each day were a blank page waiting to be gently written on again. But time is something no one can avoid. Lately her memory has grown hazy, like morning fog on a car window. Some days she forgets why she left the house. Other days she walks around the neighborhood for a long while before remembering what she meant to buy. Sometimes she stands still at an intersection, unsure of which direction leads home. Sarah, her only daughter, is growing increasingly concerned. She's an elementary school teacher who moved back in to care for her mother, especially after her father, Harold, passed away from a severe illness. Grace had always been a strong woman, not one for many words, but she kept the household in order. When Harold died, she quietly packed away the memories of the shared life without complaint. But since then, there's been a void in her eyes, as if a door to the past remains slightly ajar, never fully shut. Sarah has often urged her mother to let her do the shopping instead, or at least wait until the weekend so they could go together. But Grace always smiles gently, her eyes distant, as if looking somewhere not quite in the present. "I'm all right, dear, it's just a short walk." But for Grace, that walk is more than the street between her home and the market. It's a path through memory, a familiar rhythm she's trying to preserve. The same footsteps she once shared with her beloved husband. The corner where he used to stop and buy her a vanilla ice cream. The sunlight stretched across the sidewalk, where love once quietly passed, simple but profound. Still, even a small town can't shield one from the worries of old age. One day Grace didn't return home, prompting Sarah to frantically search everywhere. She was eventually found sitting alone in the park, strangely calm, staring silently at the lake, still holding a bag of unopened bread. When Sarah embraced her mother, tears rolled down quietly, while Grace simply smiled and said, "I suppose I wandered a little farther than planned." They say old age is like a circle turning backward. Memories drift toward childhood, new things feel unfamiliar, and old recollections shine with unusual clarity. And in those days, when her memory was as fragile as spider silk, Grace still walked, step by step, because she didn't want to be a burden, because she believed that if she just kept walking, maybe her feet would remember the way home. But sometimes she forgot which turn to take or what she was searching for. Some lonely souls don't need words, just someone to walk alongside. And fate once again softly knocked on her life's door in the form of a small creature she had never expected. That morning was colder than usual. Thin clouds drifted slowly across a silver sky, silent in the still air. A soft breeze stirred, sweeping a few dry leaves along the roadside. The rustle, like echoes of footsteps that once were, now only memories. Grace, in her old wool coat, stepped out of the house at her usual pace. past the alley where an old maple had shed its leaves, past the moss-covered stone wall, and arrived at the familiar fork in the road. But today, for some reason, she stopped longer than usual. She stood there quietly looking at the two paths as if both had become unfamiliar. Her memory was like fog on a morning windshield, thin, but enough to blur the world. She knew she'd walked this way for years, but today it felt like staring at an unopened map. She turned left, then right, then stood still. Her thin fingers gripped the basket handle a little tighter, as if searching for a bit of reassurance in the haze. And then, a small movement at the street corner caught her eye. From a patch of wild weeds by the curb, a tiny figure quietly emerged, a cat. Small, thin, its dusty gray fur clinging to its bony frame, ears perked as if it heard the world in its own way. It didn't meow, nor did it prance like playful kittens. It simply walked, each step slow, light, like wind gliding across water. It passed Grace without looking, without pause, but after a few steps, it turned back. Its eyes, though those of a stray, held something unnamed. Not curiosity, not fear, just silence, as if asking, "How long are you going to stand there?" Grace blinked. She wasn't sure what was happening, but something in the way the cat looked at her tugged gently at her heart as if it knew she was confused, knew she needed someone, even if that someone was just a small shadow by her side. The cat turned its head and continued walking. It didn't run, didn't stray. A straight, tidy path, passing rows of houses with white fences, an old bus stop with a wooden bench where she used to rest. Grace began to follow. No reason, no explanation. Perhaps simply because she had no reason to stay behind. She walked slowly, the basket swaying gently at her side. The breeze played through her silver hair, and ahead the cat quietly led the way. When Grace realized she was standing in front of her own gate, she froze. She looked at the familiar wooden gate, the lavender bushes on either side still faintly scented in the wind. She turned. The cat was already sitting on the porch steps, licking its paw, as if the journey meant nothing at all. She looked at it for a long time. Something caught in her chest, a feeling of surprise, relief, and something else too vague to name. The little cat sat calmly, looking back at her with quiet eyes. Then, without hesitation, she softly spoke the first name that came to mind. Dusty. Not because it was special, but because it was simple. The dust on its fur, the ash-gray shade like early mist, and that unspeakable stillness. Dusty. From that morning on, Grace began to notice more. Every morning, as she got ready to leave the house, Dusty was there sitting at the gate, wide golden eyes, ears tilted slightly as if listening to the soft footsteps of an old woman. No meowing, no tail waving, no rubbing up against her legs like other cats. Dusty simply walked ahead, slowly, quietly, like an ellipsis in an unfinished sentence, and Grace followed just as quietly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Together they walked, each at their own pace, yet never apart. The path to the supermarket wasn't long, but through eyes dimmed with age, it became a maze of tangled memories. Grace often forgot how many times she had turned down this very street, but Dusty didn't. He always took the right path, not fast, not slow, never wrong. And when she stopped at the market corner, he would sit by the flower bed, eyes half closed under the sun. She would go in to buy groceries and Dusty would wait, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 30. But whenever she stepped back out, he would rise, turn, and walk ahead, as if the journey had never paused. The small town began to notice the odd pair. A silver-haired old woman with a worn fabric basket and a gray cat walking a few steps ahead. No one broke the silence with words. They simply watched and smiled. A gentle smile, like a nod to something quietly beautiful and unexplained. Sarah noticed too. She didn't say much, But every time she saw Dusty from afar, her gaze softened. There was something about the little cat that made her feel reassured, though no one could say why. And Grace, gentle as ever, now walked with steadier steps, smiled more in the mornings. Because now she wasn't walking alone. Some bonds are formed from the simplest things: a look, a morning gone astray, an unnamed cat. And so, two seemingly lost souls, an aging woman losing her memories, a stray cat without a home, found each other. Not through a call, but through presence. One needed a guide, one needed somewhere to go. And somewhere in that quiet dawn, fate gently placed them side by side. No ties, no reason, just the right moment, the right soul. From that fateful morning, Dusty's presence slowly became an essential part of Grace's day. No arrangements, no announcements, yet every morning at exactly 8, the little gray shadow would appear sitting quietly by the porch like a ritual synced with the breath of time. No one knew where he came from. No collar, no sign of having ever been owned. No bell, no sound, just quiet, like the way morning mist fades in sunlight. But he came regularly, punctually, patiently, as if he understood that his presence held meaning for the elderly woman slowly forgetting the world. At first, Grace was a little puzzled, but the strange constancy of Dusty's visits grew familiar, like the ticking of a wall clock or the creak of a window in the wind. Some things don't need explaining to bring peace, so every morning, Grace left the house with her little basket. As she stepped off the porch, she looked down at the steps where Dusty always waited. They would glance at each other briefly, then Dusty would rise, turn, and begin walking. Grace would follow, her steps slow, hand gripping the basket handle as if to hold on to something solid amidst the fading contours of memory. The cat never darted off, never flinched at cars or passers-by. He followed the usual route, past the leafless trees, the ivy-covered wall, then turned onto the narrow path that led to the small supermarket nestled between low-rise buildings. It was a path Grace once knew well, but now only Dusty remembered it for her. At the destination, Dusty would stop by a potted plant near the entrance and sit. He never went inside, never wandered off, just sat, watching footsteps, eyes flickering beneath the shade. Grace would go in. However long it took, she didn't know, but when she returned, Dusty would still be there. That tilted pose, tail wrapped neatly, eyes calm, as if the world held nothing urgent. On the way back, they walked the same way, Grace behind, Dusty ahead. No words, no pressure. And each time the old wooden gate creaked open, Dusty would pause for a beat, then step aside, as if handing his companion back to the familiar porch, before quietly vanishing into the misty town. But the next day he'd return. Day after day the scene repeated, like soft waves tracing the shoreline. And before she knew it, Grace began leaving a small dish of milk on the porch. At first just a few drops as a gesture, but every morning, the dish was emptied steadily, like Dusty's presence. Sarah noticed too. She didn't object. There was something in Dusty's eyes that made it impossible to turn him away. A strange stillness, blending freedom with loyalty, detachment with attachment, as if he himself didn't understand why he stayed, only that staying felt right. One day, Sarah looked out the window and saw her mother sitting on the steps beside Dusty, dozing in the sun. She wasn't doing anything, just quietly stroking his fur with a slow, reverent motion. Between them, no words were spoken, no calls exchanged, just presence, enough to fill the quiet gaps time had left behind. Dusty never entered the house. He didn't belong within four walls, but he belonged next to Grace, at that edge between the inside world and the outside, where wandering souls find each other without explanation. Some neighbors began to notice Grace's little friend. Some occasionally left scraps of food by the roadside. Others smiled when they saw Dusty walking steadily ahead of her aging steps. One day, a neighbor's child asked his mother, "Why doesn't that cat run away?" She bent down smiling, "Because it found the one who needs it most." And that was the truth. Dusty, whose past no one knew, whether abandoned or once wild, seemed to have found a purpose when he met Grace. He wasn't a pet, an ornament, or a freeloader. He was a companion, a second pair of eyes for someone slowly losing direction, another heartbeat for a heart growing slower. And Grace, since Dusty came into her life, walked a little steadier. She still forgot things, still hesitated on the streets, but she was no longer afraid, because she knew that whenever confusion crept in, a small tail would gently flick just ahead. That quiet presence reminded her she still belonged somewhere, that she still had a travel companion, not demanding, not forcing, just walking beside her. Mornings became a quiet ritual. Grace would wake, brew tea, eat, put on her coat, and open the door, where Dusty waited. As if without speaking they had agreed, "Let's go together again today." Whether under sunshine or fog, strong wind or fallen leaves, Dusty always came, always on time, always by her side. Not all angels have wings, some just have ash gray fur and a silent gaze that leads us gently back to the memories we thought were lost. Mornings in suburban America usually begin slowly, like an old melody that doesn't need to rush. But that morning everything felt different. The sky was thick with gray, the clouds hanging so low they seemed to brush against the bare branches of the maple tree outside the window. The rain didn't pour, it simply fell quietly, steadily, like a wet silk of veil draping the town. Cold gusts of wind swept across the porch, creaking the old wooden door in rhythm with the weather's breath. Grace sat at the dining table, her eyes fixed on the window. Her wool coat was neatly folded on the chair. The familiar fabric basket hung by the door. Everything was ready as always. Everything, except one thing, was present. Dusty. The porch was empty, the steps cold and soaked. No soft footsteps, no familiar ash-gray shadow, no golden eyes half closed in waiting, no gentle flick of the tail signaled readiness for their usual walk. Grace remained seated, posture upright but heart restless. There was a silent expectation, as if all she needed to do was open the door, and that small figure would appear like every other day. But time dragged on, each minute marked by the slow, cold ticks of the wall clock. The rain hadn't grown heavier, but it had soaked into the air and into the heart. Though she didn't want to admit it, Grace began to feel uneasy, as if her quiet little world had shifted out of orbit just because one familiar step was missing. She hesitated for a long time. Then, unable to wait any longer, she put on her coat, carefully tied a scarf around her neck. Dusty or not, she had to go to the market, if only to preserve routine, or out of fear that if she didn't go, she'd lose yet another piece of her fragile memory. When she opened the door, the rain kissed her cheek like a reminder. Life isn't always gentle. The porch remained empty, but still she walked. Grace's steps that day were different. No longer steady, no longer certain. She walked, constantly glancing back, as if hoping for a sound, a gray figure, a reassurance. But the streets only offered soaked leaves plastered on sidewalks and the distant hum of cars muffled by rain. At the intersection where she and Dusty usually turned left, she stopped. Everything seemed unfamiliar. Though she had taken this route dozens of times with Dusty, today alone it felt like a maze. She stood there for a long time. Rain seeped past her collar, soaking into each fold of fabric, sharp with cold. There was no Dusty. Grace turned slowly, choosing a direction without certainty. She walked as if guided by instinct. No logic, no memory, only slow, trembling steps. When she finally stopped, She didn't recognize the place. A small, empty park, deserted in the rain. The benches were drenched, the trees hunched in silence. She sat on one of the stone benches, clutching her fabric basket, eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. The rain grew heavier. Wind hissed through the tree branches, at once soothing and scolding. Grace curled in, not from cold but from emptiness, as if the memories once held together by Dusty had slipped away with the morning rain. No one asked if she was okay. No one noticed. The whole town rushed through the rain while she sat there, a small, lonely figure adrift in too wide a space. Suddenly she remembered. There had been a moment like this before. The first time, after Harold, her husband, passed away. She had sat, lost in a familiar place made strange. But that time Harold didn't come, and this time, neither did Dusty. A very soft sound, almost swallowed by the rain. Meow. Grace looked up. At the far end of the path leading into the park, a small gray figure was walking toward her, soaked, muddy, fur matted, but eyes still quietly bright. Dusty. He walked slowly, unhurried, but with certainty in every step. No leaping, no clawing. He simply came closer and sat at her feet, where water dripped steadily from her coat's hem. No words, no call, just presence, quiet, but deep enough to bring tears. Grace bent down, her hands trembling as they touched his back, now cold and wet to the touch. But Dusty didn't pull away. He stayed, as if to say, "Sorry, I'm late, but I'm here." The rain didn't stop, but something in Grace began to mend, a torn piece of memory now stitched back together by the return of a small silhouette. She stood. Dusty walked ahead. As always, there was no need to be led anywhere, just walking together. That was enough. That evening the town seemed to fall asleep earlier than usual. The morning rain had receded, leaving a thin sheen of moisture over rooftops and trees. The air was damp and quiet, so still you could hear the soft shuffle of old leaves falling onto porches. In her small kitchen, Grace placed a dish of milk on the floor, pouring carefully. Her hands trembled slightly, but every motion was full of tenderness. She opened the back door, set the dish out on the step, then sat down on the old wooden chair tucked in the corner of the porch, where she and Harold once sat to watch summer sunsets. The old floral cushion still smelled faintly of lavender and the distant years. Dusty didn't come right away. She didn't call, she never had, but she knew. If he came tonight, she would speak, for the first time. Night wind rustled through her silver hair, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Grace tightened the scarf around her neck, eyes watching the darkness at the far end of the yard. Something in her eased, like a long aching wound gently warmed by a blanket. Not from the weather, but from hope, quiet and full. And then, as always, no warning, no footsteps, no signal. Dusty appeared. From the shadows beyond the yard, the slender figure emerged, gray fur still dotted with raindrops from the afternoon gliding across the grass. He approached the dish, sniffed, and began to drink. Small, deliberate laps. Grace said nothing, just sat quietly, hands resting on her lap, eyes following the tiny creature before her. Every movement Dusty made warmed her, like watching firelight in a hearth, silent, but enough to melt the frost. When he finished, Dusty didn't leave. He moved closer, circled the base of her chair, then leapt up calmly. She felt the light weight settle on her lap, soft damp fur pressing gently against her coat. Dusty curled into a ball, nudged his head into the crook of her elbow as if seeking warmth. Grace exhaled, letting go of something nameless that had long weighed on her chest. Her thin hand rose to stroke his back, slowly, steadily, like plucking a lullaby from memory. "Dusty," she whispered, calling his name for the first time, not to summon, but as an invitation, a quiet affirmation. "You have a place in my life. Dusty, if you'll be my friend, I'll wait for you here every day." The whisper was lost in the night wind, heard by no one but her and the cat. Dusty didn't answer with words, but pressed his head deeper into her arm, curling tighter into her lap like he had finally found a place to rest. And in that moment, not dramatic, not loud, a bond was made. Not through language, but through a single small gesture, a nuzzle, a breath of warmth, a trust freely given. That night, Grace sat on the porch for a long time. The soft yellow glow from inside the house lit her silver hair, forming a gentle halo like an autumn moon. Dusty slept on her lap, breathing steadily, his tiny heartbeat syncing with the quiet ticking of the old kitchen clock. There was something in the air that night, changed, not obvious but deep, as if a long-lost piece had finally clicked into place, completing a picture that had been missing for too long. From that day on, Grace called Dusty by name. Every time she stepped onto the porch, she would softly say, "Dusty, I'm here." Not loudly, not expecting a response, just letting the name hang in the air so that someone, wind or cat, might hear it. And that alone made her feel like she was still living with someone. And from that night, Dusty no longer left after guiding her home. He started staying longer, sleeping beneath the chair, curling up near the lavender bushes in the backyard. On windy days, Grace would find him nestled in the old wooden crate Sarah kept in the yard, where she had quietly placed a soft blanket, the way one cares for a companion without needing an invitation. Sarah often saw her mother sitting on the porch with Dusty, gently stroking his ash-gray fur, her gaze far away. She never interrupted. She understood that in those quiet evenings, her mother was finding something she'd lost, and Dusty somehow was helping her gather the pieces. It was a friendship that required no grand gestures. No one knows exactly when a stray cat becomes someone's best friend, but it happened, not through reason, only quiet understanding. And from that point on, whenever Grace said Dusty, there was something in her voice softer than a breath. No longer just a cat, no longer just a guide, but a friend. Late autumn arrived and fog wrapped around the little street each morning like a thin scarf draped across the town's shoulders. The maple leaves had turned yellow and littered the sidewalks like letters from summer left unread. In that stillness, two familiar figures continued to appear. Grace, with her fabric basket at her side, and Dusty, always a few steps ahead. The neighbors had grown used to it. They no longer found it strange to see a cat leading an elderly woman. No leash, no call, just walking, as if that's how it was meant to be. Until one morning, a young woman named Leela, new to the end of the street, happened to glance out her window and saw them for the first time. Lila was making coffee, her phone resting on the windowsill. She paused, spoon in hand, her eyes drawn to the small figure of the old woman walking slowly behind a stray cat. In the soft morning mist, they looked like two silent shadows melting into each other. No leash, no commands, just together. Lila, an animal lover working in media, instinctively reached for her phone and filmed it. The video lasted just over a minute. No effects, no edits, but in its simplicity was something that softened the heart, a beauty so pure, so real it couldn't be ignored. She didn't think much of it, just posted the video with a quiet caption. Not all angels have wings, some just have dusty fur and eyes that know the way. Then she closed her phone and went about her day. But the world outside wasn't the same after that morning. Within hours, the simple video began to spread. On animal lovers' pages, community forums, shared by strangers adding their own emotions, wonder, tenderness, gratitude, sometimes regret for things once loved but long forgotten. An elderly woman with slow steps, an unnamed cat, and a friendship without words. There was something in that silence that made people pause in a world too loud and rushed. They saw themselves in Grace, the loneliness, the fading memories, the things once cherished but no longer named. And they found hope in Dusty, the quiet loyalty, the unwavering presence, the way a small creature could become the guide for a soul slowly losing its way. Comments flooded the video. One wrote, "I didn't realize I was crying until I saw my reflection." Another said, "In a messy world, how can a cat and an old woman make me feel so healed?" Some weren't just touched, they came looking. To the little town, they wanted to meet Dusty. Some brought carriers, gourmet food, and promises of warm homes with fireplaces and garden views. They wanted to adopt him, but Dusty followed no one home. He still appeared every morning on Grace's porch at exactly 8 a.m. as if nothing had changed, and whenever a stranger came near, he would step back, not run, just turn, walking slowly toward the familiar road, as if guiding someone who was no longer there. Grace continued life as usual. Sarah told her about the video, about the people who wanted to meet Dusty, about the hundreds of thousands of views and tens of thousands of shares. Grace simply smiled, a gentle smile, light as a dandelion seed, because she understood. Not everyone saw Dusty the way she did. Not everyone could hear the language they'd been using all this time, presence. Dusty didn't need a house with a fireplace. He had a porch. More importantly, he had a place to return to, not bound by walls or leashes, but by a quiet promise. "I'll always wait for you here." A local newspaper called Grace, the woman guided by a gray-winged angel. An online page dubbed Dusty the Unnamed Guardian. But to Grace, he was simply Dusty, the cat who came from somewhere in the rain and chose to stay, not because he was held, but because he'd found a piece of himself in someone's heart. In the days that followed, the crowds faded. The buzz settled, like waves softly pulling away from the shore. But one thing remained, and never changed. Every morning at 8 o'clock, Dusty still sat on the porch, and Grace still stepped out, placed her hand gently on his head and smiled. No one needed to film it anymore, because once a miracle happens, it doesn't need an audience, just one person to believe. Winter crept in, carrying sharp winds that sliced across rooftops and bare branches. On the living room window, the first snowflakes gathered, a thin film of glimmering frost like glittering dust. The town fell into the stillness of year's end, every sound softer, every motion slower, as if the world paused to let us see what truly matters. Inside Grace's little house, everything seemed the same. But in truth, one thing had changed. Small, quiet, yet monumental. Dusty no longer left after walking her home. No more fading into the street. No more light steps disappearing behind lavender bushes. Instead, after Grace stepped through the familiar door, Dusty followed for the first time. Not rushing, just silently placing one paw on the porch, then gently weaving between her legs as if to ask, "May I stay today?" Sarah saw it from a distance through the kitchen window as she poured tea for her mother. She said nothing, just watched, her eyes softening like steam rising from the old porcelain teapot. That night, Sarah laid a small towel at the foot of the sofa, where Grace often sat knitting each evening. Dusty settled there, curling up, eyes half closed, as if he'd waited for this moment all along. His gray tail rested lightly across Grace's thin foot, an invisible thread connecting two rhythms, one slowing down, one finally finding a place to rest. Then Sarah stepped out of the kitchen, sat beside her mother, her hand gently brushing Dusty's back. She didn't speak, but in her eyes was an unspoken agreement. "Let's keep him, shall we?" Grace smiled, the smile of someone who had just witnessed something so small, yet enough to change the rest of a life. From that moment on, Dusty was no longer the stray cat who led every morning. He became part of the home, not because of papers, but because he was called by love. Dusty slept by the sofa, where Grace continued knitting endless balls of yarn, like threads of memory gently stitched back together. He lay there all afternoon, barely moving, opening his eyes only when she coughed softly or placed a hand on his back. Sometimes, just a light touch, a glance, a breath nearby was enough to feel not alone. Sarah began setting a second porcelain bowl beside the old milk dish, this time for cat food. Every night before bed, she'd crouch and whisper, "Good night, Dusty." The cat never answered, just rested his chin on Grace's foot, eyes closed like a quiet nod of trust. And just like that, Dusty stayed. No longer a guest, no longer a passerby, but part of the family. Some bonds need no words. Not everyone in our lives will guide us with language. Sometimes, the one who leads us home doesn't speak our language, but their heart knows the way. To Grace, Dusty was more than a cat. He was memory, a companion, a silent witness to the most beautiful days at the end of her life. To Dusty, Grace was more than a human. She was a warm porch, a soft breath, the first person to call him by name with unconditional gentleness. Have you ever met a cat that made you feel loved? If you too believe in small miracles, in the quiet kindness still left in this world, stay with Kitten Chronicles. We'll keep telling stories that reach the heart, one tale, one gaze, one tiny heartbeat at a time.